This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. When I started college many, many years ago, I thought that college would be the smartest people in the world arguing about the big issues. But of course, it wasn't that. So I left the academy, and I began my own school. At Unregistered Academy, we are interested in the big ideas being debated by the smartest people. And so, at our recent Unregistered Weekend in Chicago event, I brought together two of the very smartest people, I believe, who work in the space of political theory. Ben Burgis and Curtis Yarvin squared off in a debate on perhaps the biggest issue of the moment, which is democracy. Now, this debate followed one-on-one interviews I had with Curtis and Ben, which you can access by becoming a patron of Unregistered. Just go to patreon.com/unregistered, and you'll see the content there. Now, here is my interview and a debate with Ben Burgis and Curtis Yarvin. Here we are. This is the long-awaited moment, Frazier versus Ali. We have Curtis Yarvin and Ben Burgis here to debate or have a discussion about, with some disagreements, how about that as a way of putting it, over this thing called democracy, which we've already been talking about. I talked to Ben first for an hour about his feelings, and really we're talking about feelings today. His feelings about democracy, and then I talked to Curtis about his feelings about democracy. The funny thing is, neither one of them would tell me what their feelings were. Did you notice that? But I'd like to hear more about that. But first, we are gonna just let Ben respond to what Curtis said, because Curtis was the last to go, and Ben was listening, and I the whole time I had you in my mind. I was wondering what was happening in your mind, and you told me you have a lot to say about it. So let's hear it. What did you hear, and what would you like to say in response to it?
Sure. So my feeling is that I've never heard somebody try so hard to interpret somebody who fundamentally disagrees with them as somehow agreeing with them, as I heard you did with Curtis. That you might both dislike democracy, but for opposite reasons, right? You dislike it for anarchist reasons. You think, you don't like too much authority over you. Curtis thinks that the government doesn't have enough authority to get stuff done. And the part I found particularly fascinating about that was that the tour through American history, where all of the people that you seem to regard as the supervillains of American history said, we don't like democracy because democracy leads to chaos, and it doesn't let us control people as much as we want, and it doesn't let us get stuff done, and so they move to less democratic things. The move from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, those early capital P progressives you talked about. And so all of this really seemed like Curtis giving you the hard pitch about why Thad should love democracy, because this is all, look at all this anti-democratic stuff that was done to make government less democratic by all the people you most hate. And then if it wasn't clear enough what the difference is between an anarchist critique of democracy and a monarchist critique of democracy, got real clear. We started talking about cops. I think if you love cops, you and an anarchist are going to have a fundamental disagreement with each other. And one thing I would point out is if you think about cops, and you think about the way we interact with cops and how those interactions can be bad, that I think that, fundamentally bespeaks this power imbalance that that there's a much more limited range of what you can get away with when you're interacting with a cop. There is what then a cop can get away with when they're interacting with you. And what would help with that a little bit is if you had not just like symbolic oversight boards that can't really do anything, that are toothless, but ones that were really empowered to fire people, to discipline cops in serious ways that most civilian oversight boards are. In other words, more democracy.
So I think that Curtis was actually convincing me to like compliance, to abide by the authorities, whether they're democratic or not, because I just wanted to say this. My heroes, my greatest heroes, are American slaves. Why? Because we have lots of evidence of this, and it's in my book and elsewhere, that when they were working in the field, they'd be working in lines, right? And there would be a driver, a slave driver, overseeing them on a horse usually, and looking down on them, and he'd ride his horse up and down the row looking to see if they were working. And of course, and Frederick Douglass actually reported on this, as soon as the slave driver passed a slave and had his back to the slave would drop his head and stop working. And this was reported on by many people. This is a phenomenon, right? And there's a lot of examples of slaves doing the kind of thing that we have called tacit resistance, or I've called it tacit resistance, right? Just doing just enough to not get punished, just enough to not get whipped. And to me, that seems like the healthiest, maybe, way to live, at least from my point of view, according to my values. And sounds to me like you and I might agree on this, and therefore I'm not such an anarchist. I might be more of a monarchist, or whatever that is. I'm not sure it's monarchism that I'm advocating, but it is the compliance with authority. So to a degree, but again, without, and this may be where you and I, Curtis and I disagree, is that people tend to, as I said, merge their identities with authority, and that can sometimes be corporations, right? Some people are like Apple people, and they love putting the Apple logo on everything, right? Sometimes they merge their identities with the Democratic Party or with the United States of America, and that's, to me, the problem. I don't want to do that, because then I feel like I've lost all autonomy. But maybe you're counseling, Curtis, that's maybe best, is that we should give up on this idea of personal autonomy. And so therefore, what Ben is saying about anarchists not being okay with this maybe doesn't make sense.
Oh, wow. There's a lot to talk about here. I'm wondering if I should keep using my Ronald Reagan voice. I think I'll. It's sort of. I think it's reflective. Your perspective is reflective of how much leftism is sort of kind of buried in the heart of libertarianism in some ways, because what we see, if you can kind of step outside of the 19th and 20th century perspective and interpret modern populations from a fundamentally pre-modern sense, you will see that they're obsessed with autonomy, and they're obsessed with essentially atomization, and autonomy and atomization really go together and are the same kind of process. And so your sense, for example, when you're dealing with like a police officer of inherently wanting to resist that authority, that would be seen by more traditional societies as a very pathological kind of bias or way to approach that situation. And I would sort of advise two things. One is that I think sort of historically it looks bad. Secondly, it's like, was it a Dave Chappelle or a Chris Rock skit, like how not to get your ass beat by the police? Mm-hmm. I think that watching that skit should be mandatory for everyone, and will stop you from having bad encounters with the police. And I don't believe in having bad encounters with the police. On the other hand, when you look at, there's a sort of use of the word democracy to mean stuff that I like, which I think is very insidious and Orwellian and very, very wrong. So, for example, to use an opposing use of the word democracy, there was a blog that I really loved called Second City Cop, which was a Chicago cop blog. It was amazing. It was the true voice of people who actually work in the police. It was run by cops. All the commenters were cops. They were very literate and funny cops. Unfortunately, this blog had been, the target of the sort of progressive media machine in Chicago for quite some time, and they came too close to the guy running it, and he shut it down. And, so is that democracy in action? Well, it's certainly the action of the same people who would be running these oversight boards. And so in practice, what you're seeing, for example, with this is that when you see, what you'll look at when you look at a place like Chicago is you'll see massive violations of human rights going on constantly, because these are violations of the basic governmental responsibility to maintain a monopoly of violence. And what maintaining the monopoly of violence means is that you are responsible for all violence that happens. Even if that is interpersonal violence that does not involve a cop, that violence is the responsibility of the state. And there's the concept of anarcho-tyranny, Ben? It's the sort of you have this idea that's kind of, if you're kind of thinking of things in terms of autonomy, you get sort of very confused, because I'm like against the state or like for the state? Should there be like more government or less government? This concept of anarcho-tyranny, which is a Sam Francis concept, I believe, tells us is that these things actually go quite together. And so the principle of your life is not safe on the street really comes along with the principle of your life is enmeshed in sort of pointless paperwork. Or your life is not safe on the street comes with the principle of, for example, the real impact of these kinds of oversight processes is depolicing. Because what you see is that basically you reach a certain point where and I believe this is a problem in Chicago now, actually, although I can't really follow it because the only media I trusted got shut down. But once you reach a certain point where any kind of interaction that may result in some kind of criminal apprehension generates a pile of paperwork, cops just don't do that anymore. They just sit and eat donuts. And so they sit and eat donuts and basically condone just this insane level of violence that goes on. I was reading, one of the ways I like to explore the past is by reading travelogues of like European travelers. Yeah. And there's a great one called Outre-mer by Paul, I'm forgetting the last name. And he travels to Chicago in the 1890s, and he's really disturbed, basically, as a modern Victorian European coming to America, because he's heard that sometimes there are robberies within the city limits of Chicago, even in the daytime. This is something that is unheard of in like a major Victorian city. These places were as safe as Tokyo is now. And so, we see this massive, decline in standards of public order and massive flight of people from violence. And to say that the somehow the problem there is excessive policing is completely cockeyed to me.
Okay, well, I think that the statistics certainly on police violence do tell a very different story. I think that certainly the global comparative statistics on police violence tell a very different story than that. And I agree. By the way, I'm all for you using the Reagan voice because that is a reminder that because Ronald Reagan, man, that is somebody who was committed to governing, didn't let Congress push him around and tell him that he couldn't send arms from Iran to fund terrorists in Nicaragua. Mm-hmm. So if you were a big fan of a strong executive, I guess that is your guy. Mm-hmm. But I think that there are two issues with policing, just to stick with that example for a second. One is democracy, and I agree. I don't think we should use democracy to mean stuff we like. I think we should use it to mean the people having more control over the people who exercise power over them, the people who exercise that power being more accountable to the governed. I don't think shutting down a blog particularly helps with that. I think that meaningful democracy requires people having access to a wide variety of points of view so they can make up their own mind. But absolutely, having a real oversight board with real power, I think, does increase democracy. By the way, what has the least democratic accountability, and hence the most worry about how you're going to be treated in those interactions with cops that Thad was talking about, how worried he was earlier, is if it's like the corporation from RoboCop has just gotten the police contract, and then they don't need to worry about what you think at all, right? Any more than like miners had to, like Pinkertons had to worry about what miners thought about them in the 19th century. Now, I agree with Curtis, of course, that do I think that people have a right to safety? Yeah, absolutely. Do I think that like having a harsher regime of policing is a particularly effective way of enforcing that? I think if you compare different cities in the U.S. With different levels, different criminal justice policies, I'm not convinced of that. But hey, you know where you're really safe on the streets? Norway, Sweden, Finland, places like that, which have vastly more lenient, more humane, more minimalistic criminal justice systems.
What else is the difference between Chicago and Norway?
I think the difference that actually matters, you can tell yourself a just so story about culture or race that doesn't really make any sense, but I think the difference that's actually relevant is the reason that they can have a vastly more humane and minimalistic criminal justice system. Anders Breivik is getting out of prison eventually, and while he's still in, it's much nicer than American prisons. And they can also have a much lower rate of street violence, is that social democracy works. That having a big, expansive welfare state, regulatory state, tied to strong unions, with much more egalitarian social consequences, results in much less crime, even with a vastly more lenient criminal justice system, which I do think is a win for democracy.
So then another place with an unfortunately very high crime rate is Haiti. And as you may know, Haiti has been in the news lately because the State Department is proposing its nth invasion of Haiti. How would you propose applying your Norwegian model to Haiti?
Well, I think that Haiti makes my point, so thank you for that, as much as would be humanly possible to do with any example in the world, because if you wanted to pick the single country in the world that was least like a Nordic social democracy, it would be Haiti, which, frankly, vastly more closely resembles anarcho-capitalism.
Wait, run that last part past me again.
They have that Haiti, how much of a welfare state does Haiti have? How much of a regulatory state does Haiti have? One of the things in the WikiLeaks cables, the State Department cables that were released, that were leaked, is that there was an effort during the first Obama term to increase the minimum wage in Haiti to, I believe, the princely sum of about $5 US a day. That was successfully lobbied against, among others, by the American State Department on behalf of American companies. That's about as weak a regulatory state as you could hope for. Power is wildly dispersed. Again, this is one of the least social democratic countries on the planet.
Do you suppose that's a cause or an effect? Have you spent a lot of time in like the third world? Have you, like, I actually, when I was 6 or 7, I lived in the Dominican Republic, which is next door to Haiti. I'm sort of wondering why you think that this model has not been more widely applied in the third world, given the fact that these policies can turn Haiti into Norway.
Well, I don't think that your lived experience of being there is actually very relevant. I think what's relevant is the trivially available public data that you yourself just recited a minute ago, right? The nth intervention in Haiti that like Jean-Bertrand Aristide, when he ran for president of Haiti, his original campaign slogan, swear I'm not making this up, was that he wanted to raise the Haitian people from misery to poverty, right? This is a very This is a very unambitious reform program, right? This is the most minimal effort at some kind of lefty reform program you could get, but you try that shit in America's Monroe Doctrine backyard, and you end up getting stuff like Aristide being literally kidnapped and taken out of the country by U.S. Marines in 2004. You broaden your view beyond Haiti, and you start looking at the rest of the Western Hemisphere south of the United States. You see, for example, you want to talk about attempts to implement something like a Nordic model. You see Salvador Allende in Chile being a democratic socialist, get a president, being killed and removed in a coup that's very openly supported by the United States. You see that in Guatemala in '54. You see that versions of that in Haiti numerous times. This is not ancient Cold War history. I mentioned Haiti in 2004. We could also talk about Venezuela in 2002, unsuccessful attempt. We could also talk about Honduras in 2009.
Can we actually?
I think so. I think that there is a pattern that emerges here, and I understand you don't want to see it, but like this is a really clear pattern.
The pattern is one that I'm sort of very familiar with from my experiences with Ritter. My dad was a Foreign Service officer and worked in the State Department for many years. His first post was the Dominican Republic, which was the site of one of these interventions. I think it's very possible to take that view when you look at a sort of very high and blurry level at these things. When you sort of descend a little bit deeper into, for example, the Nelson Rockefeller era of, he was the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, which means he was basically the sort of proconsul for Latin America. You'll see, for example, let's take, for example, the example of Allende versus Pinochet in Chile. What you'll see if you do what's called a prosopography, which is an analysis of social network connections, is that Allende is, I would say, much, much more of an American figure than Pinochet. Pinochet is a very Chilean figure. Even in Argentina, he would have been weird. Allende is a globalist. He's a member of basically the global Americanized elite. One time I had, in the early 2000s, before I acquired some of my political direction, I had a boss who was Brazilian. He was actually Brazilian Chinese. And one day he came to me and he's like, what's really strange is that, like, my wife is a documentary filmmaker, and so she's kind of part of this world, and she's like very Americanized, and she hates America. And my brother-in-law runs a video store, and he loves George W. Bush. And how does this come about? And I'm like, it's very simple. The most Americanized people in the world are the most anti-American. And you'll find this pattern. You'll find this pattern among kind of Latin American elites everywhere. And so, from my perspective, the State Department in its Latin American policies is actually very much guided by a sort of mix between kind of the Orthodox School of Latin American Studies kind of program that we've been hearing from you and reality. And so if you take, for example, the case of Aristide in Haiti, the idea of a $5 a day minimum wage in the country where the average wage is probably 75 cents a day would go very, very far toward ruining what is left of the Haitian economy. And when you look at Aristide in particular, there's a lot that reminds us of, for example, our good friend Comandante Chavez, and that Chavez managed to take Venezuela. Chavez managed to escape all of this alleged CIA ExxonMobil plotting and actually run his own country in Latin America, and with great advice from the more radical wing of the School of Latin American Studies and the Sandinistas, if you know the term, and all those kinds of people. And the result was that he basically took the country in Latin America with the most resources and turned it into this incredible pit. And so, the idea of doing that same kind of maneuver in a country without oil would have been, sort of extremely remarkable. And you can bet your socks that among the people in the State Department who sort of countenanced the withdrawal of Aristide, that there was not a Republican among them. There are no Republicans in the State Department, zero. Like, if they exist, they spend their time deep in the closet. Moreover, and I'd be happy to point you to a link that basically, far from being, you simply don't notice all of the times that, from this perspective, that America has gone out and evangelized the, quote, non-communist left. All of the, Kennedy going down to Latin America in the 60s and supporting opera, Alliance for Progress in Peru, and saying things like the only alternative to violent revolution is peaceful revolution. You're going to get a revolution whether you like it or not, guys. And, the sheer amount, this goes on with Wilson's intervention in Veracruz in Mexico, where Wilson basically, you have this Porfirio Diaz, who, basically anything that works in Mexico was either created by colonialism or by what were called the científicos of Diaz. Diaz retires, and he's like, okay, I want this guy, was it Maduro? Basically this other thug to replace me. And America is like, oh no, we must not have thugs. And so, you basically get this kind of classic Wilson-Debs split between American candidates in Mexico, where the Wilsonites support Cardenas and the real hotheads, the John Reed types, support Pancho Villa. Your heroes would definitely be on the Villa side. And the result is this incredible Mexican Civil War that kills like 2 or 3 million people and reduces the country to a state of anarchy that it has not yet escaped from. And so, when I compare, the America's guilt in promoting leftism in Latin America, which, by the way, goes all the way back to the original Monroe Doctrine, because the original Monroe Doctrine was a policy inspired by England. It was really an English policy that was treating us as a satellite state. And the goal of that policy was to assure commercial dominance for English merchants, capitalists, in Latin America. This is why soccer is such a big thing in Buenos Aires. And it worked very well at that. And the policy was basically no monarchs, no European monarchs in Latin America. Mm-hmm. And then the Brazilians tried to have their own monarchy, which was actually kind of freaking cool, being Emperor of Brazil and all of that. And then the policy was, of course, you had the affair of Maximilian in Mexico, which was only possible due to the Civil War. As soon as the Civil War is over, the Americans are like, hey, Louis Napoleon, like, didn't you read the paper? Like, we have a huge army here, and we're ready to invade Mexico if you don't get rid of this empire. So Mexico had to go back to, like, broken third world government. And so, the sort of influence of basically imposing leftist systems on what was originally the peaceful and happy empire of New Spain is, for me, basically the sort of cause of all these troubles.
Yeah, so most of that's wrong. Porfirio Diaz did not retire. He was overthrown after fixing an election to get himself reelected. He was overthrown. He died in Europe, still plotting his unsuccessful return to power. Cardenas, you're talking about, didn't come in until the 1930s, a couple decades.
Oh no, you're talking about a different Cardenas.
Okay, I don't think so, but people can look into this.
I'm talking about the constitutionalist that Wilson was supporting.
Certainly, the initial legitimately elected government immediately after Porfirio Diaz was overthrown with very direct participation from the U.S. ambassador in Mexico. Another of those famous examples of America promoting leftism in Latin America, which is very much the opposite of what most of the track record is. We also heard a bunch of things that I'm not quite sure how they all fit together or how they're supposed to be relevant to the original point. The original point being that even very mildly reformist left governments in Latin America are very hard to keep going in the face of American state opposition. Now, we heard that people in the State Department are Democrats instead of Republicans. I don't know why that distinction would be relevant to anything. Of course this stuff is bipartisan. LBJ, look at what he did in the Dominican Republic, for example. I've never had the slightest doubt about American empire being a bipartisan project. We heard that, no, social democratic policies would have been a disaster there, so I guess it's good that they couldn't be implemented in these various cases. None of this is particularly relevant to the original point, which is that if you look at economic models, what you have in a place like Haiti is the polar opposite of something like the Nordic countries with their strong labor unions, strong regulatory state, extremely expansive welfare state, and the latter works a whole lot better than the former in delivering those basic goods of a more reasonable, less authoritarian criminal justice system married to a low crime rate.
And you really think that nobody has ever had the idea of using the Norwegian system of government in Haiti? Like you're convinced of that?
When on earth did I say that? Did I just say that and black out? I never. In fact, what I said is almost literally the opposite of that, Curtis. What I said is that attempts at doing things that fall way short of that were not allowed to happen.
If we go back to the Haitian Revolution, my God, certainly that was allowed to happen. That was some pretty. You should read Lothrop Stoddard's The French Revolution in San Domingo. It's a really amazing work. And this reminds me of the sort of the story of
the Haitian Revolution was allowed to happen.
The story
and
of
they were forced to pay reparations to France up until the 20th century. So if you want to know something about the economic origins of the distinction between Haiti and Norway, that might be a place to start.
Right, because they were paying off their relatively small national debt. It's true, they don't have oil there. They do have sugar, though. They had to pay reparations to their former slave owners for the loss of property in the slave revolution. That's what happened. And the genocide, and the but yeah,
the number of people that we're talking about there.
It's small. It's
tiny.
As
now,
Stalin,
in comparison to what you mentioned,
Stalin,
I really enjoyed when you mentioned George W. Bush earlier, because if you want an executive who's not going to let himself be pushed around by Congress, who's going to get stuff done, like detaining American citizens without trial, like starting a worldwide torture regime, like starting a drone war, that's your dude, unitary executive. I hope everybody enjoys the result.
Let's go back instead of debating. I recently mentioned that for many years I drank several cups of coffee a day, and that about a year ago I started to experience an irregular heartbeat from it. My doctor told me very directly that I needed to cut down on my caffeine intake. Amazingly, shortly after that, the folks at Magic Mind got in touch with me. Apparently, their CEO had the same issue, and he started the company to address it. He and his team of nutritionists developed a new herbal supplement that comes in a delicious 2-ounce shot, which has replaced coffee in my morning routine. It contains matcha from Japan, which gives me exactly the right kind of long-lasting but not edgy stimulation that keeps me focused and going, as well as several amazing adaptogens and nootropics sourced from India and British Columbia that keep my stress in check and my mind on task. Best of all, my irregular heartbeat is gone. Now, I start every day with my shot of Magic Mind. And now that I've been using it for several months, I can report a significant increase in productivity. The book manuscript that I was having a famously difficult time finishing is now complete. Right now, my friends at Magic Mind are offering listeners of Unregistered an unprecedented offer. You should go to magicmind.co/unregistered and get 40% off your subscription for the next 10 days with my code UNREGISTERED20. Again, to get this phenomenal deal on the best part of my morning routine, go to magicmind.co/unregistered and use my discount code UNREGISTERED20. Thank you.
Everybody enjoys the result.
Let's go back, instead of debating Latin American history, let's go back to Ben's original point, which is twofold, I think, here, is that, number one, I think you're positing that social democracy is the vehicle for democracy, right? But then also you then said that I think you said the United States state, the American state, has been hostile to social democratic movements abroad. Is that right? And it sounds like it's inherently to you that the U.S. state is inherently hostile to social democracy in other countries.
I think that the U.S. state is inherently hostile to anything that's bad for American business interests, and that they certainly, in what it's traditionally regarded as its backyard, it's been very violently hostile to anything perceived as getting in the way of American business interests.
So let me give a little history, which is not Latin America, but it is U.S. foreign policy thinkers. So, I mean, Franklin Roosevelt's whole intention with World War II was to export the New Deal to Europe, and then that's exactly what happened with the Marshall Plan, right? And also LBJ and Eisenhower both, they had the exact same intention for Vietnam. They said we want to bring the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, to the Mekong Delta. They wanted to develop these countries in all sorts of ways, and one of them was to just simply establish New Deal type social democratic political structures in those countries. So and also, I mean, the social democracies that you like so much in Northern Europe have been the greatest allies, the staunchest allies of the United States, and the United States has loved them.
No, definitely not. I mean, look, no, absolutely not. They have a look at the relationship between some of the most significant social democratic leaders in Northern Europe. Look at some of what they were saying about Vietnam. They have I don't think the staunchest allies claim is true. I mean, now if you want to do the more minimal claim, right, that they have sure, I mean, the United States may be happy to work with countries that, especially ones over which it's in a position to exert very little direct control, but that can benefit the United States in all sorts of ways. Geopolitically, is happy to work with places that might have a variety of internal regimes. Yeah, of course, right? But I also think that really, especially if we're going to talk about social democracy, I mean, I know I've read Robert Caro. I know that LBJ expressed some fond thoughts about who'd be great if we had TVA in the Mekong Delta. I think if you actually look at the regime that we were propping up in Vietnam, it did not do a lot of stuff like that. But I think that more broadly, when we talk about social democracy, what we're really talking about is not just sort of any kind of reform that might include some element of welfarism. I mean, you certainly have that coming from all sorts of sources that are totally separate from that. I mean, you've got Bismarck, establishing some basic social insurance, and what we're talking about is stuff that comes out of the labor movement and the socialist movement and expresses the aspirations of those things. Typically, we talk about social democracy, we're talking about reforms, rather than revolution. But I think if we're going to be historically specific, that's what we're talking about. And certainly, in those countries over which America has expressed the most economic and political dominance, any attempts at doing anything that would be even close to what we have in the United States, never mind this kind of more extensive democracy, has been often met with quite a bit of hostility. And that is a major reason why it's been so difficult to implement that in Latin America.
Can I offer an alternate reason for that?
Sure.
I would say the alternate reason for that is that the farther you go from Norway, the more transparently insane these policies are. I would love to make you like the dictator of Haiti for a year or two. You should actually look into the 1920s and 30s occupation of Haiti, because I think that if you read primary sources from the period, you might change your very I hesitate to say, your very linear perspective on what was going on there. I feel like in some ways you're sort of a prisoner of this kind of 20th century Cold War worldview, which is itself really an American propaganda construct. So one of the things that you see across the board within the Cold War is I would sort of encourage you to compare the U.S. response to the Soviet Union, for example, to the response to right-wing powers like Nazi Germany, where the idea of we're going to be at peace with Nazi Germany and have a Cold War with them rather than starting a worldwide war and invading Europe was not even considered an option. And
Why do you think that is?
It's why do I think that is? I think that's because America. It boggles my mind how difficult it is to see as an American that America has always been a fundamentally left-wing power. We forget that Karl Marx praised Lincoln to the skies constantly. We forget that Lincoln's party was the most left-wing party in the world at the time. We forget the incredibly close and really, I would say, culpable relationship of the U.S. with the USSR, not only during the 40s, but during the teens and 20s and 30s, when it was committing its worst atrocities. Even in the Cold War period, when the American liberal establishment...
The teens, when
yes.
not only did the United States not recognize the Soviet Union, but Woodrow Wilson sent troops
That's right.
in order to aid
That's
the
right.
white armies in the Russian Civil War.
That's exactly, and when you look more closely at what happened, you realize that, for example, I think point 7 of the 14 points is essentially hands off the Bolsheviks. You realize that the troops that the U.S. sent to the Russian Revolution were not actually there to suppress the Russian Revolution. They were there to essentially sandbag certain British and French efforts to suppress the Russian Revolution, which would have saved tens of millions of lives.
Okay.
And so
that's not all true.
So
this is an important
so
point to make.
you have
this really is news from an alternate dimension here.
So for example, there's a great book which is a biography. Do you know? I'm curious as to how you feel about Wilson, but there's actually a biography of Wilson by Herbert Hoover that I read, and it includes this wonderful detail which is entirely consistent with what I find when I look into the period, that in 1917, Wilson was, not 1919, or early 1920, was it? Wilson was coming back from his grand tour of Europe, in which he's received as basically the president of the world in this insane experience. And who happens to be coming back to him with him is David Francis, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. Now, Francis was the former governor of Missouri, and he was essentially during this conflict, the U.S. had 2 embassies to Russia. It had an embassy to the Kerensky regime, and then it had what was called the Red Cross mission, which was actually basically Wall Street's embassy to the Bolsheviks. And this business of basically supporting revolution around the world had become a very big American business, and actually kind of lucrative when you looked at relationships with these revolutionary regimes. For example, the massive magnesium concession in Georgia that Averell Harriman got in the 20s. That's Georgia, the other Georgia. And so Francis is coming back on the same ship as Woodrow Wilson, who's appointed him the ambassador. He's coming back for medical reasons. Wilson won't even see him, even though they're both on the George Washington together. And then there is an episode which I find entirely convincing, but I've never read about before, but I don't see why Hoover would make it up. Hoover, of course, was a big progressive of the era, where Wilson sends this cable to Paris and London. And this cable is like, hey guys, I've just been informed that you're supporting these whites in Russia. And they're really very bad people. They're monarchists. The term fascist wasn't available yet. They're reactionaries. They're really bad people. And what I don't understand, and what I'm going to find really hard to explain to the American public, is the fact is you guys owe us a lot of money. And that instead of paying us back, you're aiding these monarchists, these reactionaries. I don't think American public opinion is going to take to that very well. And so essentially the sort of cutoff of Allied aid to the whites, which is what allows the Reds to win that war, was very much a policy of liberal internationalism in Washington. Moreover, you keep using the term.
Let's not moreover here, because we just went over a lot of territory, and I just want to note that all of that adds up to saying that when Wilson, what do you think I think about Wilson? He's somebody who...
You're more of a Debs man, right?
He's somebody who, yes, very much so, who rounded up and imprisoned all of the people who agreed with me, who were in the United States at the time. I think exactly what you think I think. But also, note that when we're thinking about this USSR Nazi Germany comparison, that they say, well, look, all we did with the USSR was initially support the whites in the Russian Civil War, but like do it in kind of a half-hearted way, and then like cut off aid. So really, if you think about it, it's as if we were supporting them, and that's being contrasted to Nazi Germany, where there was certainly nothing remotely like that level of attempt to counter that system in 1933 and 1934, and where the United States did slowly get there over time in response not to some, as I'm sure you know and would recognize, not in response to, some humanitarian objection to what, the Nazi Germany's internal system was, but as a response to its global ambitions and the things that it was doing in pursuit of those global ambitions, and ultimately to defend England against it. I guarantee you that if the Soviet Air Force had been bombing London, that would have played out in a very similar way.
I think that, I guess I would say it's kind of, I sort of want you to broaden your historical reading beyond Howard Zinn. Like,
This is so glib and silly, and there is just no trace of a real argument here. This is just lines and insults. There's no engagement with any ideas.
I'd like
it's
to
silly.
recommend a couple of books. I think Charles Beard's history. He was certainly a progressive. So his histories, and you'll find a lot of your perspective in early Beard work. I think, reading his President Roosevelt, and he was
going to be such a tedious conversation if we do shit like, I'm going to really recommend that you broaden your reading. This is the least reasonable way to engage with people. If we want to actually talk about this stuff, you got to cut that out.
Sure. Well, if you don't, I'm sort of hearing these kinds of arguments from authority from you, and
like
it's
what?
very true.
Like what? What would be an argument from authority again?
For example, you're like, America supported the whites in the Russian Civil War. All historical
How
authorities.
is that an argument from authority?
All historical authorities will agree with you.
Sorry.
And my point was that when I basically read the primary sources, I find that what was going on was, in fact, the reverse.
So the argument from authority is that I said something that most historians would agree with.
Yes,
So
that's
the problem is none of us, even me, the professional historian up here, has read those primary sources. Not many of them, at least not the way that you have.
No.
So you can't really test this.
Of course. And it's sort of when you're basically sort of within the sort of narrative of like most historians appears to you as sort of as broad as the world. But for me, like this narrative that you're within, it's like, imagine if you'd grown up in the Soviet Union and you got everything you knew from the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, which is a work that actually exists. How would I sort of convince you that basically that narrative, which every Soviet historian believes in, is, a fairy tale?
Wait, hold on. Has the United States government been interested in exporting democracy? Yes or no?
Oh my God, since the very beginning. I mean, if you read, Washington's farewell address, the farewell address is a sort of wonderful kind of piece of isolationist rhetoric. Mm-hmm. It's really great, and it's doing no more than repeating basically the essential tenets of classical international law as understood by everyone at the time. And one of those tenets is that one thing that you don't do is support rebels in other people's countries. That's an act of war. And so you sort of read Washington as saying this, and you're like, well, this is like the great American tradition. And then you read about Citizen Genet and so forth, and you're like, no, actually, what you're really reading in the farewell address is basically like a drunk swearing off alcohol. And he's going to keep drinking. And so, for example, you see the same thing, for example, in 1848 with America's just incredibly enthusiastic reception of like Louis Kossuth when he comes to America, the Kossuth story. Mm-hmm. Garibaldi is a huge hero to like Americans everywhere. And, this sense of basically like promoting Castro when he comes to the UN in the late 50s is treated like this incredible rock star. I mean,
yes, America is very well known for its love for Fidel Castro
Oh,
and its
yeah.
attempts to keep him in
Oh,
power.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
The numerous attempts to
Yeah,
assassinate the guy.
I can point you.
The almost literally ended human civilization to stop Cuba from defending itself
to the testimony
against invasion,
Yes,
Cuban Missile Crisis.
I can point you to the testimony of the last ambassador to Batista before Congress, describing how essentially everyone at state and CIA was supporting Castro, who essentially got his job through the New York Times, as they say, by having an interview with Herbert Matthews, where he basically presented himself as like the voice, as like the John F. Kennedy of Cuba. That was essentially widely believed by all the cool people in America, all the Ernest Hemingways.
Gosh, how long did that last?
Yeah, it lasted until basically Castro declared that he was on the side of the Soviets.
And then what's happened in the last 60 years continuously?
At that point, basically, of course, you switch to a Cold War pattern where what you see over and over again, all of these patterns that you see make perfect sense if you see the US and the Soviet Union as competing revolutionary empires. And so, for example, let's look, for example, at South Africa. Okay, at South Africa, again, you have this sort of standard, well-worn Utne reader, we supported the regime in South Africa. Actually, the US was trying to overthrow the regime in South Africa basically constantly from 1945 after. What you mean by support is essentially condone. When you use this word prop up, what you're actually saying is that the US is not trying hard enough to revolutionize these countries.
That's not at all what I'm saying. Not even close. What I'm talking about is the United States supporting coups against democratic-elected governments during and after the Cold War. What I'm talking about is the armies that enforced systems like Pinochet in Chile, who, by the way, may have been less Americanized, but is definitely America's man in that situation, that the officer corps being trained in Fort Benning. I'm talking about all sorts of military aid to these places. This is not trying hard enough to overthrow it. And certainly, if you think that the United States is acting like a revolutionary empire, I don't know what the cause of this revolution is. Because to go back to Thad's original question about the United States exporting democracy, I think very frequently the United States has used that rhetoric. Sometimes there's been some alignment between that and what's actually happened. Very often, it's used that rhetoric when there's been no alignment whatsoever between that and what was actually happening. It depends on what's convenient to American interests at any given time. I mean, go back to that Mexican Revolution example, those constitutionalists that Curtis is talking about, the U.S.
Carranza,
support. There we go. Supporting. Yeah. So Carranza, big Democrat there. They have there's the guy who basically proceeded to govern just like Porfirio Diaz had, and who the United States was actively helping to crush Pancho Villa.
Right, and then
try to crush
you're more of a Villa man. How do you feel about Chavez?
Can you give us a
Chavez story?
Sure, but I'm going to finish this point first. So by the way, they have. In the course of doing that, they have, I think, let's just say this, I think that the United States, the idea of the United States has been friendly, certainly in any sort of consistent way, to democracy in Mexico is going to be very hard to square with the historical record. But sure, let's talk about Venezuela. I think if you look at the most of the time that Chavez was actually in office, they have the economic effects you're talking about didn't happen yet. Now you can tell a story where you're going to say, well, okay, but this was just like a time bomb, that it was all set up to do this. So even though those first 10 years in power, extreme poverty in Venezuela was sliced in half, this was all predestined to lead to what eventually happened, mostly in the Maduro years. I think that they have and I think that there's all sorts of stories you can tell about why that happened. I think multiple ones of those include some element of truth. That you could tell a story about currency mismanagement. You could tell certainly a lot of stories about corruption. But one thing that I think is not going to make a tremendous amount of sense is to do the usual lazy right-wing thing and say, oh, aha, see what did this is socialism. Socialism did this. in Venezuela, when you actually look at the stats on Venezuela, even at the height of Chavez's welfare state, the public sector in Venezuela was smaller than the public sector in France. It was barely bigger than the one in the United States. And so certainly the idea, whatever your preferred explanation is of what happened there, the idea that this is just like an inevitable consequence of getting a little too socialist and this is going to happen to your economy is really hard to square with the global comparative stats.
What's your best example of third world socialism?
So when you say third world,
I mean, not Norway.
Not Norway. They have a so why is it? Tell me your story about why you think that what's effective in Europe can't be effective outside of Europe, because I've been really unclear about this whole time.
Oh wow, that's a really interesting question. Let's take Japan and Haiti as our examples, because they're both island nations, and they both. One of them is very economically successful and the other one isn't. So if we could say, well, the infrastructure in Japan is much better than the infrastructure in Haiti. So what would be your expectation if leaving the governments of both countries the same, we transport all the Haitians to Japan and all the Japanese people to Haiti?
So is there going to be an answer to the question I just asked that's like come in through Socratic dialogue, or are we going to get to it?
Yes. Give me your answer first.
What's my answer for?
What's your answer for
why there's better infrastructure in Japan
my
than
answer
Haiti?
is the same answer given by Joseph Dermaistre, 200 years ago, when someone talked to him about the human race and human rights, and his answer is that he had never met a human. He had met Russians and Frenchmen and Englishmen, but as far as these humans, he had no evidence of them whatsoever.
So it's just about the innate difference between Japanese people and Haitian people?
Innate difference or cultural difference, Curtis?
Innate difference or cultural difference? Design an experiment to separate the two, and then I'll tell you.
Okay, there we go. That's an interesting answer. So I think that's certainly part of the answer. And by the way, useful to this comparison to know which one of those countries is more internally democratic. Not even close, right? Japan is vastly more internally democratic.
How do you define? I really want to get back to this definition of democracy, because in Japan, has been a one-party state since 1945. It's been run by the Liberal Democratic Party, and it's been run specifically by the LDP bureaucracy, which is one of the most famous bureaucracies in the world. And so, over which the electorate seems to have absolutely no control whatsoever. So how you define Japan as very democratic, I think would get into this.
Japan is much more democratic than Haiti.
I know. I'm getting you to answer the question.
I didn't say very democratic, and I answered your question like half an hour ago, but I'll answer it again. They have that democracy is about the empowerment of the public to have more influence over policy, to have ways of getting their will done, and the accountability of decision makers to the governed. Now, again, it's a spectrum. I did not say Japan is very democratic. I said it's vastly more democratic than Haiti. The current government of Haiti, very much, by the way, propped up by the United States, and not in some sense the United States isn't trying hard enough to overthrow it, but we're literally about to send over some troops to help that government hold on to power, which absolutely nobody in Haiti voted for, the current government, and in general in Japan. One-party system or not, I think that you wouldn't deny that they have much more real elections. They're much less likely to do things like ban wildly popular political parties like Lavales in Haiti.
They don't have, it's a one-party state. What part of one-party state don't you understand?
Okay, the part of how you're using it I don't understand is what you mean, because it's the way the rest of us use this phrase one-party state is for a state where only one political party is allowed. There are several political parties in Japan. They elect people to their parliament.
There were several parties in communist East Germany. There were several political parties in communist Poland. This problem is a problem that has been solved, of having a completely non-democratic government with a perfectly good simulacrum of government. Here's a suggestion. Let me ask a question to sort of evaluate your belief in
God,
democracy
say
in
what
that
you're gonna
sense.
say.
So suppose that we say we're going to make America more democratic by rendering government more accountable to the politician who America elects in the only election that Americans still really care about. And so we're going to put the president completely in control of the executive branch. Would you feel that that made the U.S. government more or less democratic? Or would it depend on who was elected?
That's a good question.
I would say less. I think if you look at, for example, I think it was a good thing back. I've heard you make the claim many times about FDR being essentially like a king, but FDR still felt the need, even after Pearl Harbor, to get Congress's permission to declare war because the norm hadn't been established yet that the president could just ignore that. Now, maybe you think that transition is a good thing.
Stalin asked the Supreme Soviet for the same thing. But
that you can just go to war without having to ask Congress. I think that transition's a bad thing. I think that when George W. Bush started setting up procedures by which people could be held outside of any normal judicial systems, that people could be assassinated by drones in countries that we're not at war with, etc. I think that was a bad thing. I mean, if you think that's a good thing, then we have a real disagreement. And I'd also point out, by the way, just in terms of the effects of democracy on current U.S. foreign policy, or the lack of democracy on current U.S. foreign policy, you can look at the Quincy Institute. They have a bunch of good information on this. Americans, 49% to 37% think the United States should be doing more to promote diplomacy to end the war in Ukraine. And if we all die due to the war in Ukraine, it's going to be because that doesn't count for anything in terms of how American foreign policy is made in practice.
I'm glad. Can we agree on that note of isolationism? Can we find that a really good note? For reference, the U.S. was basically involved in a de facto war against Nazi Germany for most of 1940 and 1941, but that's sort of relatively well established. So I think the declaration of war is a nice touch, but it came from also a rubber stamp Congress. And, but to sort of move past the historical point, I'm not sure if you really answered my question or not. It seemed the question of whether putting the president in charge of the executive branch, it would not make things more democratic, even though it would give the people more power.
Well, I don't accept the premise that it would give the people more power.
But they're choosing the politician who's in power.
In fact, when you pitch this, right? Mm-hmm. At least when I've heard you pitch this before, saw your appearance in the Young Turks, for example, the way that you pitch it is precisely that in your preferred model, which sometimes you use words like monarchy, sometimes it just sounds like you're saying, well, it'd still be Democrat, we just have a very strong executive. But in your preferred model, what you see as a virtue of it is that instead of there being public input on specific policies, the only public input is like choosing a wise ruler whose judgment we're just going to trust for the next 4 years. And that's the part that seems fundamentally at odds with democratic values.
So what do you mean by public input? Do you mean the notice and comment period for federal regulations? Do you mean? I mean
the actual ability and practice of the public to work its will.
I see no such ability. Give some examples. How does the public work its will?
Well, here's an easy example. We were talking earlier during my one-on-one with Thad, we were talking about Florida. So, my favorite, this is an extreme example, but my favorite stat about the 2020 election, my favorite factoid about the 2020 election is that Trump won Florida, but the $15 minimum wage won by a lot more than Trump did in Florida. Or you can look at what happened just now in Kansas, for example, with the rejection by a high double-digit margin of attempts to make it easier to restrict abortion. Now, those are really easy examples because those are cases where the public is actually directly voting on things.
Right.
But
how do you feel about the public rejection of gay marriage?
I think that in that case, the public is making a decision that I don't like, but I absolutely think that's better decided democratically.
So you believe that the Supreme Court decision...
I don't believe in judicial review. I'm thoroughly on record about this. I think that that we want an empowered, mobilized public protecting basic rights rather than the courts. In fact, this idea, the popular right-wing narrative at the time, that the people want marriage defined, well, the way the Bible actually doesn't, but whatever, is between one man, one woman. It's these elitists in robes who are stopping that. Actually, whereas that had been very recently true, by the time the Supreme Court decision happened, public opinion has shifted wildly on that in the direction of support for marriage equality. Probably the Supreme Court decision wouldn't have happened if not for that, because they wouldn't have felt they could get away with that. But yeah, I do think that it's better to establish these things democratically. I think it's very healthy that, like in the Republic of Ireland, for example, abortion rights and gay marriage were both came about by popular referendum in both of those. I actually trust building a majority consensus on a topic like that a hell of a lot more than I trust that somebody on the panel of 9 Harvard and Yale graduates is just going to do what I want.
Do you think that the construction of this popular consensus, and this is sort of what I really want to get into in the difference between populism and democracy and managed democracy, as your George Soros men will call, for example, what's going on in Hungary. So one of the things that's very clearly established by the 20th century is that essentially control of the media allows you to control public opinion. Public opinion is not a cause but an effect. If you had basically all of mainstream journalism in the United States had somehow been Nazi for the last 30 years, everybody would be a Nazi. And so when you basically sort of punt things like, and I happen to, just personally agree with this particular decision on gay marriage, but that's sort of neither here nor there. When I look at basically how public opinion is changed, and to borrow a nice word from Noam Chomsky, manufactured, of course Chomsky is really going back to Lippmann when he refers to manufacturing consent. What I see is simply a machine that could manufacture consent for really just about anything.
Yeah. Fortunately, that's not true, and I think we have evidence that that's not true. That in some of the very examples that we just went over. So I think that, for example, it's not the case that 12% more Americans support diplomacy in Ukraine than oppose it. Because, the New York Times and all those people you call the cathedral have been so relentlessly advocating peace and de-escalation in Ukraine. I missed that.
I think supporting diplomacy for most people means supporting the State Department, which is not.
I think if you look at the wording of the poll questions, that was specifically even if there were territorial concessions involved. I think that something like the $15 minimum wage example. I think there are a lot of cases in which, look, does propaganda work? Sure. It often works for a long time. It's variable. It depends on the issue. It depends on a lot of other factors. I don't think that seeing the media and academia as being sort of omnipotent over public opinion is particularly accurate. I think it captures part of a complex reality, but I also think it misses a lot of it.
Ben, how many Americans do you think are capable of being democratic? Or would be interested in being democratic? Would be interested or capable in participating in a real way that you would respect in governance?
Yeah, I think it's already the case that Americans do have some avenues for public participation, and I think that's a good thing. I think that there are other avenues that we could have, for example, by having a much stronger labor union movement. This has historically been a hugely important way for ordinary working class people to have more influence collectively over the political process. That somebody like LBJ was mentioned.
Can I speak to that for a moment?
In a moment, you can. Yeah,
if they agree with the union.
But I think that that in that case, again, if you're talking about sort of expression of widely perceived interests, that they have there is going to be some collective influence. There's certainly going to be much more collective influence with that than without that. Is this going to be good for the wages of people who work menial jobs is a question that politicians are going to have to spend a lot more time worrying about if they're worried about what organized labor is going to do than if they're not worried about it. And again, I think to the extent that politicians whose natural instincts may not have been at all in those directions, I mean, go back and look at LBJ in the 40s. If you look at what some of them have done in a political environment where workers did influence more, exercise more political influence, yeah, that's a good thing. I think that if people have more free time, which by the way is also something that can be a function of social democracy and the regulatory state and welfare state, if people have more free time, and at least some of them, not everybody, doesn't have to be everybody, but if some of them spend that time being more politically active, again, that's a good thing, and you're going to get decisions that take their interests into account. Again, it's a spectrum. If you just say, do we have perfect democracy, do we have no democracy, then sure, it's easy to go with the no democracy option. But I think more democracy is, broadly speaking, a good thing, and I'll appeal to the example.
I'm sorry, but but it seems very clear to me that most Americans, probably the vast majority of Americans, are not only not interested in being democratic, but they're not interested in politics at all. Now, what do you do if you want democracy, and that doesn't it require them to be at least somewhat involved in this?
Yeah.
And what do you do if you impose democracy? I mean, it seems to me you're in the situation that the founding fathers were in, where they're looking at streets full of drunks and fornicators, and they're thinking, well, we're going to give these people power over, governance. That's still somewhat the case, but it's just apathy. People play video
and
games
QAnon. Let's not forget QAnon.
So
Americans believe in angels, and
we're back to the transition to less democracy from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution carried out by people you don't like for reasons you don't like, which somehow is an anti-democracy lesson
No, I'm
to
just
you. I don't
asking what
understand
you want
that.
to do with American people,
Yeah,
with the
I don't-
Americans as they are.
I think the American people as they are, if they exercise more political influence, that would be a good thing.
But they don't want
They
to.
have
at that
a
point.
okay.
They're not
I
interested.
don't think that's true, and I'm going to give you a couple of specific reasons to think that that's not true. One, go back to the union example. Look at polling on who wants to be a member of a labor union versus who actually is. Who says they would like that versus who actually does. Actually organizing a union under current circumstances involves a tremendous amount of risk. People get fired for it constantly. Look at what's happened in Starbucks in the last year. There are all kinds of ways that are set up to sort of pressure and blackmail people into backing down from it when they start. But you look at the polls, say, hey, would you like to be a member of a union? You'll get like several times more people than are actually members to say yes. You get enough people voting in Florida that even though it's not what you predict for the partisan alignment of the state, you get the $15 minimum wage through. Again, I think if public opinion counted more, even in foreign policy, I think that the outlook right now for World War III would be a lot less terrifying. I think that Afghanistan, sure, if the public had more control over foreign policy, I'm sure the invasion would have happened at the same time that it did. But I also think it would have ended like 15 years earlier. I don't think there's any question about that. That was like wildly unpopular many, many years before finally the Band-Aid was torn off. So yeah, I think that I think that even more people would be willing to participate more, given less financial stress and more free time, which, by the way, are social democratic policy goals.
True.
But but even if you look at right now, people as they are, yeah, QAnon or no QAnon, I think that there are sure lots of wildly irrational things that lots of Americans believe. There are lots of wildly irrational things that members of the American elite believe. There are lots of wildly irrational things that whatever tech CEO gets to become Caesar if Curtis gets his way believe, right? That they have. So I think that if we're looking not for perfect outcomes, but we're saying, are the outcomes going to be better or going to be worse, right? If the 68% of Americans who want full federal weed legalization got their way, for example, right, is that better or worse? I think it's better. If the large majorities of Americans who want universal health care and a higher minimum wage, Curtis and I, judging by the Latin America discussion, would have very, very different takes about whether that would be good or not. But certainly in my book, that would be very good. I will take a little belief in angels in exchange.
Cool. So I want to I think the history of labor unions is sort of a very good way to discuss the difference between populism and progressivism, because you can sort of often get a progressive to endorse kind of populism and broadly in general, but when it comes out with its real populist shit, it tends to elect Trump, and people don't really like that. And because people find themselves concerned about all sorts of things they shouldn't be concerned about, like their personal safety and stuff. And so when you look at the history of the labor union movement in America, I think there's a clear, to me, populism is basically unorganized, sort of genuinely grassroots, bottom-up exercise of political power. And progressivism is basically organized farming of political power among essentially a disempowered client class. And for me, the moment in the history of American unionism, of the American labor unions, the labor union is just a ridiculous anachronism in today's world. It can in no way be compared to what it was 100 years ago. And what you see this transition from kind of more wildcatty labor organizations, like, for example, the Knights of Labor, which are actually led by laborers. And when these organizations are actually led by laborers, the problem is they tend to do crazy shit. What was the time the Knights of Labor massacred a whole camp full of Chinese workers because they were being competed with, right? And basically what you see is a coordination of these supposedly independent movements until they're sort of no more than, what is the SIEU but a branch of the Democratic Party? Come on, let's get real. And so you basically see them becoming essentially the kind of controlled establishment-controlled labor unions that you also see, by the way, in Eastern Europe between 1945 and 1989. And so you're essentially, when you're sort of looking at these things and you're like, why doesn't Joe Sixpack, who drinks, Pabst Blue Ribbon, stop complaining about illegal immigrants and imports taking his jobs away? And why doesn't he vote to contribute 10% of his salary to some guy who was educated at Harvard? I think it's a pretty obvious take in a way for Joe Sixpack, and it's kind of surprising how long he's kept with this insane program.
Incredibly lazy caricature
Ben, hang on
of working class Americans
Ben,
is in a different galaxy than what public opinion tells you about what most Americans think.
Okay, hang on one second. So we're going to go to Q&A in a second, but I want to let each of you say whatever you want to say before we do that. Go ahead, Ben.
Sure. I think if you actually look at Joe Sixpack's immigration views as measured by actual polls, which I think are a better way of figuring out what people think, take a broad randomized scientific sample rather than just sort of what's Curtis's impression of Joe Sixpack. I think that you'll find out that actually, certainly by global standards, that there is a lot more support for things like a path to citizenship and even liberalization of legal immigration than you might think. I would also point out that Donald Trump, when he was elected, was really underselling the very Reaganite economics that, to a great extent, he actually implemented, and he was going around and lying about how he was going to bring the jobs back. In places like West Virginia, where there were even fewer by the time he left office than when he came in. He was going around and lying about wanting a less hawkish foreign policy when he actually tore up the Iran nuclear deal and assassinated Soleimani, and, by the way, sent heavy weaponry to Ukraine, which Obama had been unwilling to do, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it's that, no, Joe Sixpack doesn't really support any of the social democratic stuff, whatever the polls might say about universal health care and the minimum wage. They're really Trumpians. I also don't think it's true that the SEIU is nothing but a branch of the Democratic Party. It's certainly not true that it's remotely comparable to meaningless state unions that couldn't go on strike, et cetera, in Eastern European countries during the Cold War. I think if you actually talk to most members of that, they're very aware of the difference it makes for wages, the difference it makes for job security. If you're worried about free speech or being canceled, by the way, then probably the main thing you're worried about, America in 2022, unless you're Edward Snowden or something, you're probably not that worried about being killed or in prison. You're probably worried about losing your job. And whereas the alleged candidate of Joe Sixpack, Donald Trump, filled the National Labor Relations Board with people who were so reluctant to undermine employers' firing abilities that they sided with Google against James Damore, unions actually, in real life, protect the free speech rights of members who disagree with what union leadership thinks all the goddamn time. So yeah, I think that widespread unionization is a good way to make this a more democratic country in the simple sense of giving ordinary people more power over what's going on, and that would be a very, very, very good thing.
Curtis.
I would say I sort of, it's sort of difficult coping with a level of mythos this intense because you sort of, you kind of live within a certain narrative, and it's a narrative that, of course, we all know very well, having grown up in a world where basically Howard Zinn is everybody's high school history textbook. And the sort of the sense of like suggesting that there are other ways to parse and understand these realities is like hard for someone, it's hard to convey to someone who doesn't seem to have that spirit of questioning per se. And so I think that you know, what I would recommend, honestly, like for you as a progressive intellectual, I guess, have you done a lot of like menial labor? Have you worked in factories and stuff or anything?
I have worked I have worked at jobs where I've stood in trucks for 8 hours a day every day, loading and unloading boxes. That's not anything I would bring up because I actually don't think, I think that much like liberals who fetishize lived experience, I think that there's all these constant appeals to what anybody has or hasn't done are pretty intellectually vacuous, almost as much so as saying, well, I pity you because you're trapped in narratives, and if you only understood the truth, which I am a conveyor of, you would understand that I'm right, which cannot possibly be mistaken for an argument.
No, it's not an argument. It's actually sort of, because we live in very different realities, we can't really argue. And this is why, basically, rather than encouraging you to read right-wing materials, I want to encourage you to read older left-wing materials. I think that this will give you sort of a little bit more of a perspective of simply how different the time of your sort of, like how different a thing unions were 100 years ago from now, and you seem to be sort of conflating that America with this America in many, many ways. And it's hard to like, that's kind of the best advice that I can give you on how to open your mind a little bit, and I sort of welcome
Jesus
the reverse.
Christ, this is vacuous nonsense. I'm going to give you advice about how to open your mind a little bit.
I welcome the reverse.
We're here to talk about this underlying issue,
sure.
And Curtis is wasting all of his time grandstanding about how he's discovered the truth, and he pities people who don't get it yet.
Sure. I mean, when I talk about things that to me seem like obvious realities, they're not valid realities within your mythos. And so we can't really have that conversation because you're simply referring back to facts within the story.
That's why we should talk less
about
history.
What a silly waste of this opportunity.
Less about history and more about ideas. And so I want to turn it over to you all. Please, fire away. Oh boy, okay, we have a lot here. I'm trying to think about the audio. Should I just You can just talk, and then I will relay the question through the microphone. I'll restate it, so give it a beat before you answer. I have no idea who answered first. I'm going to go with Tori first here.
Okay. I guess the question that I felt was most relevant, I don't know, sort of, is to Ben. It was in relation to what he was talking about, with people not being interested in politics in a real genuine kind of way, which I agree with. I don't think people are. There would be more people here. But I think the question is, like, do you not think irrationality is a result of disinterest in reality?
Do you not think irrationality is a result of a disinterest?
Sorry, I couldn't have phrased that double negative. Do you think irrationality is a result of disinterest?
Do you think irrationality is a result of disinterest in reality?
Yeah, and for people who are watching this or listening to this later, the setup to the question was about what Thad had said earlier about, not enough people maybe being interested in political involvement. And so I do want to just quickly do both halves of that question. So I think that, sure, irrationality, one source of irrationality can certainly just be a kind of epistemic apathy, that you're not, you're not sufficiently driven to figure out, what's true. If we're talking about an empirical issue, you're not sufficiently driven to figure out how to have internally consistent values. If we're talking about a normative issue, fair enough, right? But to connect the two subjects, the reason why I'm so unpersuaded by this as an argument against democracy, even beyond what I would see as the sort of in principle right that people have to govern their own lives, their own collective destinies, is that I'm not convinced that we could avoid that problem by empowering an elite to make these decisions, because they can be plenty irrational in their own ways. Again, I think that right now we're kind of on the verge of a global thermonuclear exchange because of extreme elite irrationality.
Wait, hang on. Follow up. Yep, go ahead, Tori.
I was just going to say, the only thing I have to say to that is I think that there are plenty of people in power, and that's like even the powerful have a disinterest in reality, and that's why you can't even, border. I don't necessarily think we're that close to that, but also I think a lot of that has to do with their disinterest in engaging with reality, because it might be less desirable than, just a chill life or whatever.
Yeah. So part of what you said is that people have, that it shows that they too are disinterested in reality, and fair enough, right? But if we agree there's irrationality all around, then what I need to hear next is a really good reason for thinking that elite irrationality is less worrying than popular irrationality, and then we, I think, might have at least the beginnings of an anti-democratic argument.
Well, I think that there's, fortunately, if you're looking at, it's good because I feel like we've sort of arrived at some common ground in a way where we've basically admitted that there are sources of oligarchic elite error, as you say, and I really like this skepticism of the Ukraine thing, because as far as I'm aware, your skepticism of the Ukraine thing is not really aligned with any particular movement or any particular authority. I think it's just your own personal opinion, and I think that's and it's out of step with what the New York Times wants you to believe, and I think
trust me,
great.
Very few beliefs I have line up with what the New York Times thinks.
And yeah, they're normally to the left of them, I would expect, but this one is not, because you're basically more pro-Putin than the average American.
Well,
and
I would push back against the.
Let's not descend into the weeds. Let's get to a point of agreement here.
That makes you pro-Putin.
That was unfair. That was unfair.
I don't think being against the war in Iraq.
That was an unfair jab, and I retract the remark. I want to say that basically, when we look at these two systems or forms of power. One of them, which we could call oligarchical progressivism, and the other one of which we could call democratic populism. We agree that there are significant structural flaws with both of these ways of governing mankind. And that's why it's so unfortunate that there are only two possible systems of government: democracy and oligarchy.
No, for sure. As you point out, labor unions that could actually protect people's free speech rights, actually give them a living wage, etc., and actually are starting to have many of these benefits from people who are organizing them now, that's anachronistic. We need to go with cutting-edge new ideas like monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right, right here in the front.
Great, thanks. Another.
No, go ahead.
Okay. For you, Ben, you talked earlier about universal basic income, and you were talking about how if you work for an employer, your free speech rights are restricted. Certainly true, you can't say anything sometimes, and whatever you want. Sometimes you have to say exactly what they say in particular job circumstances. But then you overlay the intersection of UBI and democracy, and you start giving everybody money. There's no world that I can see of, and I don't think this is just a lack of imagination. I think this is human nature, where those people who are controlling that money are not also controlling behavior. And maybe that's being done democratically, it's democratic, but just like the aunt of Thad, who ultimately wanted something for their money, the government or whoever is controlling that money is going to want something out of those people. If this was a year ago and we had UBI, you would not be able to get it if you were unvaccinated. Whatever the popular democratic feeling is at the time against any particular ideology, those people are going to be shut out.
Well, this is very testable.
They will be shut out. Democracy will work against truly UBI. So how do those square?
You're really good at restating their question.
Sure, sure. So the question was, going back, and I'm not sure when people are actually watching or listening to this, if they'll have all seen our previous discussion. So earlier during my solo with Thad, he was talking about his aunt who gave him these like very generous gifts of money when he was like, whatever, starting when he was like 12 or 13 or something, and he'd get like $100 gift from his aunt, and he was excited about it, but then like he'd kind of have to pick up the phone when his aunt called, and then she'd start like objecting to his behavior, and you should be smoking weed and all that, right? So is this a good metaphor for a more expansive welfare state, essentially, the kinds of universal social programs that I would support? And the questioner connected that discussion up specifically with whether if we had UBI, then that would be that would be changed to a NUBI, non-universal basic income. There would be conditions.
In the context especially of democracy, and not a strong man who could hold the line.
Yeah, the strong man would actually be able to impose conditions. It'd be much harder for democratically elected politicians to, and I can explain why in a second. But so the suggestion from the questioner, again, just for people watching or listening later, was that specifically last year you would have been denied it if you weren't vaccinated. Now, I point out a couple things about this because I think it's much better when there is empirical evidence that's available to go with that instead of just speculating about what sounds to us like what would happen. So Alaska, for example, actually does have a small UBI, the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is a just bizarrely socialistic thing that exists in Alaska of all places, from their oil drilling that everybody gets sent a check. Far as I know, if there are Alaskans here who can correct me, that was not conditioned on vaccination last year. Now, you can say, well, maybe that's Alaska, maybe that's because of the politics of the state. So now we can start to ask questions about other countries that have various sorts of universal state provision of services. Were Canadians who didn't?
So I'm from Kansas.
Sure. No, go for it. Just keep in mind before you say this that I'm going to have to repeat it before I respond to it because people are not going to hear you.
Okay, so I'm one of those people who moved from Canada to Florida, to the glorious Republic of Florida 2 years ago. In very large part to get away from what was happening there with the COVID lockdowns and whatnot. And there was the denial of medical service to the unvaccinated and a lot of other stuff that went around with it. So the popular will there was way, way, way more aligned with the pro-vax thing than it was in the US. And what you saw was that manifested itself specifically in policy and in denial of service to certain people under certain conditions. Everything from directly from operations not being done to people who weren't able to visit their loved ones in the hospital because they weren't vaccinated.
Yeah, so there are two very different things that are being grouped together there, and I think it's important to make a distinction. So what the questioner said when he came back in is that he's from Canada, and he moved to Florida because he doesn't like the COVID policies in Canada, and there was a claim about denial of medical services, and there was a claim about people not being able to visit hospitals because that was seen or claimed to be whatever unsafe because of concern about the spread of COVID, was specifically when they were unvaccinated. That was the question, and I would say that I think we'd have to have a bigger discussion about this, but certainly one thing that and please just correct me briefly, right? So I don't have to repeat a bunch of stuff if I'm wrong about this, right? But it's not the case that there was a law passed in Canada saying you're no longer eligible for Canadian Medicare in general if you're not vaccinated. I think what you're talking about are specific policy, specific hospitals saying, we've made a determination that it's not safe to do this at this time because it's not medically urgent and there's this risk that goes with it, because we're concerned about the spread of COVID, which is a very different thing. And then really, to connect it back up with Thad's Thad's aunt, and the larger issue about welfare states and personal freedom, if you have a private hospital that is especially in a more laissez-faire environment, less regulation, man, they could go way further in that direction if they wanted to. And there's a reason why you're not getting that law saying oh no, Canadian Medicare is no longer universal, this social insurance only applies to people who've been vaccinated, because even in a context where those COVID policies you don't like were actually fairly popular, in the broad mass of Canadians, including, by the way, the majority of Canadian truck drivers. But even in that context, that would have been wildly unpopular. It would have been really hard to get away with that because of the level of popular opposition that provokes, because once you've got those universal programs in place, as people with other politics may bemoan, it's really, really, really hard politically to take them away, which I would celebrate. And I just say, look, if you're worried that that if we had the America Permanent Fund instead of the Alaska Permanent Fund, that would be made contingent, I would just point out how much harder it is to change a well-established social program and end its universality. How much harder that is than your boss just saying, you know what, I'm sick of you, you're fired. So if you're worried about Thad's aunt, private employers, private charity, private sources of funds are going to be a way bigger concern about depending on people's whims and how they can give and take away than things that you get as a universal right of citizenship.
Can I interject a little? Sorry.
Yeah, you can. Go ahead.
So there's always this equation that I see in your reasoning about democracy, and especially democracy and bureaucracy, that it always seems that the things that you like are democratic and the things that you dislike aren't. And so when we look at these specific kinds of policies in Canada, you're absolutely right that these policies are not carried out by these sort of symbolic elected arms anymore. Oh no, they're done by permanent commissions. And they're done nationally by permanent commissions. And so the question of basically what sort of the kind of we must enforce vaccination kind of hysteria over the last year or two is, I think, very interesting, because it certainly didn't come from popular enthusiasm. It became a popular enthusiasm in some quarters. It became a popular enthusiasm in quarters that are basically very NPR listening quarters, you might say. And the way in which basically that side of the, do you remember the amazing flip in like public versus elite opinion about COVID that happened in February 2020?
No.
Do you remember how in like basically through all of February, the message was like, what you really should be worrying about is the flu. Don't be a bigot. Go to Chinatown and lick doorknobs.
Yes.
And then Donald Trump, Trump,
you
changed his mind and was like,
You need to read more leftists. You'd be surprised how many people are pointing that out. Just like with the Ukraine, you'd be surprised by how many leftists think that.
Yeah. And you can point that out. The meaning of that is sort of kind of extremely dark and disturbing in a way, because basically this policy effectively was left up to the whims of Donald Trump. Because if Donald Trump had come out and instead of saying, oh no, if COVID is real, the stock market will go down and I won't get reelected, if he'd instead come out and said, General Jack D. Ripper style, we must preserve America's precious bodily fluids, you can guarantee that American elite opinion would have followed basically the Swedish path. And I think that and it's remarkable even that Sweden's own bureaucracy followed a path that was out of step with basically global elite opinion. That was remarkable. And sort of, kind of an interesting case of sort of the exception that proves the rule in some ways. But the whole world, just like they went mad for George Floyd, went basically mad for let's take the anti-Donald Trump position in early March of 2020. And I think that there are, in some ways cases to be made for both perspectives. I'm kind of a COVID moderate, which I know is very unusual in this group. But I think the dynamics of where that elite opinion came from tell us a lot about basically the flaws in essentially elite governance. And I think that agreeing with you that there are really systemic flaws in elite governance and there are really systemic flaws in like unfettered, uncontrolled, unmanaged public opinion is like, I think, an important point of agreement between us, and I don't want to like let that form of agreement slide. And I think that understanding, sort of building more of an understanding of why elite governance goes wrong. I don't know how you feel about the lab leak theory, but I'm a believer in that as well. It wouldn't surprise. Do you believe in the lab leak, or do you believe?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not completely sure, but even to be not sure is great. Because there are very few elite sources of opinion telling you to be not sure. There's some great articles in Vanity Fair actually about the lab leak. But most journalists on the science beat are captive to the virology community. And the virology community basically doesn't want people to know that like this was a gain of function experiment that got out of control, or at least even that it was possible that it was a gain of function experiment that got out of control.
As you know, right? Again, I think that the way, one of my sort of bigger picture beefs with a lot of what you say is that, the way you use terms like left and right tends to be, I think, about cultural attitudes, often much more so than it's about what politics, I think, is most fundamentally about, which is distribution of power and the distribution of material resources. So then, when it comes to something like the New York Times, because you see that as the left, then, you're surprised when I disagree with them. But look, I mean, like Noam Chomsky, who's come up a couple times in this conversation, there's a story you can find on YouTube, both Christopher Hitchens and Gore Vidal telling the story about Chomsky at the dentist, where he's told his dentist asked, "You grind your teeth?" He says, "I don't think so." Right? And he asks his wife, Miss Chomsky, does he grind his teeth like in the night while he's asleep? She says, "No, I don't think so. I've never noticed that." And they can't figure it out until the next morning she realizes that he grinds his teeth in the morning while he reads the New York Times. Because it pisses him off so much, right? I don't like the New York Times. I like, and I know you read this article because you brought it up on the Young Turks, I like current affairs, right? Where my friend Nathan Robinson put out a big thing about this. That's one of the reasons, that
Oh yeah, no, I really
you know.
respected that Nathan Robinson piece, and he's also a very snappy dresser. And as
No
ZZ Top has said,
no comment on that one.
I think we could all take a leaf from Nathan Robinson's page there, and he dresses like Disraeli, in fact, and it's so good, and so sort of whenever you find kind of the light of independent thinking burning, and there are ways in which it can sort of burn in this like sort of fatally flawed, like kind of very historically cliched leftist perspective and sort of explode out of that in beautiful ways. And like, one of the ways in which you see these kinds of beautiful explosions of independent thought are very like Nathan Robinson being like, no, actually, I'm going to think for myself on this thing. And once I think for myself, it's obvious what's going on. And
so can I, if I promise this really is a question, this is not a statement. Yeah. Can I just ask okay, yeah. So brief question, right? Because you spent all this time talking up the values of things that I also care about curiosity, about independent thought, about standing outside of established narratives, all of which would make me think that that you'd be a big fan of free speech, diversity of perspectives, all of that stuff. So does it seem to you that in dictatorships, monarchies, that those tend to be things that in which free speech and a wide variety of views tend to flourish more than they do in democracies?
That's an excellent question, and I think that if you read Tocqueville, for example, Tocqueville, people are like, oh, cancel culture. This is the thing that was invented in like 2012 or something. Tocqueville in Democracy in America describes it almost perfectly in the 1830s, and he describes basically democratic America as the place in the world that had the least free speech, and I think that's absolutely true. If you basically look at, for example, the latitude of political opinion that you could express in, let's say, France in 1770, it's wildly greater than the latitude that you can express today. In fact, the latitude of opinion, there are many things you could say in America in 1850 that you can no longer say. And so, to me, when I basically look at sort of democracy in the sense that we have it today, no, I feel that the range of perspectives within the entire Overton window is incredibly narrow on a historical perspective, and the way in which it looks large to us. And this is sort of why I've sort of been kind of encouraging you to kind of just go wild and go into the Google Books world and go outside the world of that bubble, because just read any book from the 20s. You'll find all kinds of crazy-ass weird shit.
For a minute there, you were actually having a conversation about the ideas instead of retreating into this smug Reddit shit where it's like, oh, open your mind and, and receive the truth.
We were just talking about opening our minds. When I show you how to actually do it, you're like horrified.
Oh, my God. Curtis, you cannot be this fucking dumb about this. They have I'm not horrified by reading shit on Google Books. I am sad and disappointed that you're wasting time in what could be a useful conversation doing this posturing about, oh, see, you're trapped in narratives. I've realized the truth.
Which is why we're going to go to the questions. Right here.
Okay, so I got 2 questions, one for each, if that's okay?
Sure.
Okay.
2 questions, one for each. Go ahead.
Ben, you talk, big democracy proponent, you've talked about polls a bit. Curtis thinks polls are fake. In that it's a way to manage democracy. Do you think we live under a managed democracy? Mm-hmm. Or I guess, can you kind of talk on
The question is, to Ben, is do you think we live in a managed democracy?
Right.
Yeah, and the setup to that question was about me talking about polls and Curtis thinking polls are fake.
Right. I didn't say that exactly, but...
Not in that.
I
said it more crass because I'm but a simpleton. Curtis, Ben thinks we should help, or Haiti would be improved by raising the minimum wage. Do you think Haiti would be improved by improving the population stock through a sort of eugenics program?
Does Curtis think...
Man, I'm super curious about that. Curtis should go first.
There's actually
Wait. The question is, because we've got to make sure we get this recorded. The question is, Curtis, do you think Haiti would be improved by introducing a
Sort of
eugenics to improve the human stock, the population stock?
I'm not really a big believer in population replacement in general. And when I think of Haiti, when I think of a place, I think of a people, really. And, sort of the idea of like improving Haitians by making them non-Haitian doesn't really make any sense to me. The question I would ask instead is, one of the things that you find in all pre-modern political thinkers is this belief that the Constitution has to be fitted to the country and its people, especially, obviously, the people and not the geography. Because I think, if you move the Japanese nation to Haiti, I think they do perfectly fine. And so the question of what sort of governance the actual people of Haiti need, I think, is somewhat unanswered. I think it doesn't look like anything like what they have now, and I also don't really think it looks particularly like Norway. I would love to see Ben be dictator of Haiti for like 2 or 3 years. I think that would be absolutely informative.
I think if you think that
you could just listen to public opinion.
That I think that that is how anything I want in Haiti could come about. Man, you have not paid attention for the last couple hours.
I don't think that could come about, but I'd still like to see it. I think it would be.
I would like to hear you explain your views about this to Haitians. I think that'd be fascinating.
No, I think that actually, if you go, one of the things that I love doing is I love talking to immigrant Uber drivers, and it's surprising.
You and Tom Friedman.
It's like surprising how much their perspective of their own country differs from the perspective that you get from reading the New York Times. If you ask most people,
Curtis, you don't listen.
If you ask, no, because the thing is, to me, like your New York Times thing is, you're like, no, I follow the Utne Reader instead, and like,
Jesus Christ.
my grandparents.
I barely know what the Utne Reader is.
My grandparents were.
Does anybody read the Utne Reader? Is the Washington Post part of the cathedral?
Yeah,
they just called for
U.S.
U.S. intervention in Haiti.
No, I mean my grandparents were American communists, so I recognize this line of discourse very, very well, and
no idea what that's supposed to mean.
They never used the word communist to me. They would always say progressive, and so when I basically like lump together one of the things that's very irritating when you talk to leftists is you'll basically be ascribed some policy to like the Popular Front of Judea, and they'll be like, no, that's a policy of the Judean Popular Front. We're totally against the People's Front of Judea, right? And sort of that's kind of the, like, when I use the New York Times as a metonym for sort of the whole space of intelligent opinion, I realize that you object to being included in that.
Yes, you're right. It is irritating to leftists when you say things that lump together things that are at opposite extremes, fail to make basic distinctions because they would fuck with your worldview. They are very much. They are very much so small. They are very much.
But they look very, very different.
They are very much at opposite extremes. And certainly on the question of views towards American foreign policy, again, there's a reason that the New York Times makes Noam Chomsky grind his teeth. If you read Chomsky and Herman, Manufacturing Consent, which is where everything that's plausible and what Curtis says about the cathedral comes from, if you read that, I think he is very on point about the ways in which Cold War anti-communism certainly shaped the space of political discourse that could be allowable in the New York Times, about how certain reflexive assumptions about American foreign policy did, and certainly about the relationship between the thing that he never wants to talk about, which is the actual power centers in American society, which are not journalists and academics at all, right? Those are hired hands. The actual power centers in American society are people who own that stuff. And no, what they want, I think, differs just a little bit more. I think that what corporate oligarchs who own media want is not particularly what I want. And if you think the difference between corporate oligarchs getting everything they want and democratic socialism is a difference between the Popular Front for the Liberation of Judea and the Judean Liberation Army, or whatever the hell the Monty Python line is, I would just respectfully submit that you're not thinking about it very carefully.
Yeah, let's go into actually the ownership of journalism question or the management of journalism question, because I think it's actually a super interesting question. I think one of the important, a lot of what of your narrative, which basically strikes me as almost entirely out of touch with the way things work in this country today, strikes me as much more resonant with the way things worked in, say, the 1920s. And so I feel like I'm sort of, when you talk about corporate oligarchs, I feel like we're talking about the ghost of J.P. Morgan and Henry Clay Frick and people like that.
Or gosh,
I think
Jeff
if you look at, so let's talk about Jeff Bezos for a moment, because I would be, if Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, okay, the Shullenberger family has managing control of the New York Times. There's an important difference here, and the difference is it is almost impossible for me to imagine Jeff Bezos trying to manipulate the New York Times, the Washington Post news desk in order to get, for example, favorable coverage for Amazon. That would be unbelievable to me, based on the limited knowledge. I'm not in the profession, based on the limited knowledge that I have of the way journalism works. Whereas at the Times, the Shullenberger family, which is the last great family of media oligarchs, still has an influence on the managing editor and basically the choice of the news. I was talking to, not the person you would think, someone who's connected to like a media oligarch, and they were like, from a left-wing perspective actually, or not a media, like a tech oligarch, a left-wing tech oligarch, and they were like, maybe we should just buy the New York Times and like convert it to like effective altruism or whatever. And I'm like, look at the market cap. It's like I could put it on my MasterCard, and I'm like, no, you can't put it on your MasterCard, because you can't, if the Shullenbergers would never sell to you, but if you could buy that, you would find that you were just another basically sponsor of an almost entirely autonomous organization. And that, but yeah, if you go back to the 20s, and the golden age of, or the system that, say, Joseph Pulitzer was trying to destroy, the golden age of like Hearst and yellow journalism, if you look at Hearst's influence over the Hearst press, and you compare it to Bezos's influence over the newspaper that he owns, I would say there are probably 4 orders of magnitude in difference between that level of influence. And so it's like, when I basically think of you as a kind of operating in this kind of caricatured mythos, which I can trace back to the 20s, I think one of the ways that you could have of asking yourself that question is by going back to when these things were actually true and looking at that reality and comparing it to the reality of today.
Yeah, how about the early 2000s? Would that be more like the 1920s? Would it be more like now?
Tell me your early 2000s.
Well,
story.
How about MSNBC? Look at the political transformations of that network, right? That they had they were at one point trying to compete, with Fox for the right wing space. They fired the people who were against the Iraq War, who worked there. And then, seeing a better marketing opportunity later, they dramatically transitioned into what they are now, right? Which is the Lib network, and I don't think.
Let's talk about Fox. Can we talk directly about Fox?
I mean, we can talk about Fox too, but the point of the MSNBC example is that's a very direct example of ownership making decisions that dramatically change what the newsroom looks like.
So if you basically talk about, and I didn't know that piece of history with MSNBC, let's talk about Fox, which is something that I know basically much better. So the Fox business, Fox is not the real media. And this is something that has sort of only become clearer over time. It's like these sort of idiots who wanted to expose, the sort of Biden-Ukraine corruption by leaking Hunter Biden's emails to the New York Post. They might as well have been leaking them to the trash can or to QAnon or to 4chan. They probably would have done better to leak them to 4chan, actually. And the sense in which basically journalism that is respected journalism operates by changing elite opinion. Let me give you an example example from my own, well, not my knowledge. So I have a number of DC kinds of connections, and one of the things I like to brag about is that my mother has actually kissed Joe Biden. And it was not a romantic kiss. It was because she's married to my stepfather, who worked on the Hill for Biden for many years. And he, in turn, got his PhD in 1965 in political science from Harvard, and then went off to work for Democrats on the Hill, which he did for 20 years, and now he teaches at Hopkins. And he recounts this story. Do you know the name McGeorge Bundy? Mm-hmm. He was in a seminar taught by McGeorge Bundy sometime in the mid-'60s at Harvard. And there was something that happened back then when they had sort of more real unions, which they had strikes. And there was a newspaper strike on at the time, and McGeorge Bundy comes in, and of course he has a DC role in addition to being at Harvard. He comes into the room with these like bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, 1960s suit and tie wearing, political science students. He's like, well, Washington can't function now. We've lost our inter-office memo system, meaning the New York Times. And the effect of essentially authorized kind of official story journalism does not go through the public before it has an impact. It goes basically from one arm of the state to another. And so when the Times, basically writes a story about, hey, EPA isn't cracking down on this abuse, EPA gets on it tomorrow, that's real power. Fox doesn't have that power. And Fox, so, when you basically see Fox going out there and marketing to the plebes, they've basically made a decision to make money rather than power out of journalism. And, I believe that's crass and horrifying, and, I have the negative opinion about it that you probably do. But that's, to me, a really, really huge difference.
Okay, let's take another question. Let's go to John in the back.
Ben.
Yep.
What do you think? I'm sure you would agree with the policy objectives of ESG. Do you think that's adequate, or is that a representation of democracy in your view?
Sorry, ESG.
Oh.
Oh, and it's environmental and social governance. It's destroying returns in the market.
Well, it's a code. It's a code of conduct, I believe, for corporations that some governments are starting to impose, and corporations are imposing it on themselves too, right?
Environmental and social governance. Yeah, I think that's mostly epiphenomenal and mostly meaningless.
Well, why?
Because I think that the case for that having meaningful impact, being most of what drives what's going to happen in corporations, would have to be made. I think the more obvious case would be that corporations are by and large interested in maximizing revenue, and that sure, it could be a nice public relations thing to slap some of this environmental social governance rhetoric on, and to occasionally generate some piece of writing that where you justify what you've done in those terms. But I think it just is very unlikely on the face of it that would be by and large what would dictate actual behavior. In fact, I think this is kind of a perfect case for. Curtis has this very antiquated view about the influence of the New York Times, but I think that the sort of broader issue here with all of this stuff is, who do you think actually exercises power when push comes to shove? And I agree, Jeff Bezos would have no reason that he would need to mess with the news desk. They're never, none of those nerds are ever going to do anything that would hint at anything that would undermine his interests in any way. In fact, if they would, they wouldn't have those jobs in the first place, right? You don't need to interfere. The editors who are ultimately making those decisions, if they had a thought in their heads that would somehow undermine Bezos and his economic interests, they would never have passed through any of the hoops to get those jobs in the first place. But there's a sort of more general thing, which is this view of the world that no, it's not real power is not exercised by the guy who can say, Jeff Bezos, with his ownership of newspapers, with his ability to blackmail entire, not only local but state governments by threatening to pull out of areas, who can donate vast amounts of money to politicians. No, that's not real power. The real power is being exercised by his well-heeled hired help, who run the Washington Post for him, or who have some sort of like diversity officer, job in somewhere in the corporate structure. And I think that that's just fundamentally wrong.
So we have 15 minutes left, so I want to go to another question. Right here.
So Curtis has quoted the motto of the state of Missouri, which is Salix Populi Supremus Lex. So I translate that as the quality of the people, not the health of the people, but the quality of the people is the most important thing. And after listening to both of you and having read some of what you've each written, I think that's actually something you agree on, that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
So if we look at a century of progressivism, here in Cook County, we're at the end of that. We spend $22,500 per pupil for education. The state has a monopoly on education, K through 12 education. 40% of the students can't correctly label the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean on a map. Okay, that doesn't look like I'm getting value for my tax dollar. When I look at the defense of the country, we haven't won a war in 70 years, and the amount of money we're spending is incredible. It looks more like a transfer for looting the public treasury and transferring the money to defense contractors and various other people involved in the war. When I look at health, 85% of the population is obese, overweight or obese. 40% have diabetes. And I can go down the line. There are some things that government does well, but I don't see how anyone can avoid the conclusion that progressive government has failed utterly. And why are we even talking about continuing more progressive government? How do we improve the quality of the people? And I don't know the answer to that, but neither one of you has actually touched on that.
Do you want to? So he listed several things that have been government projects, funding of things like education and the military, and we've gotten only bad results. And so it seems to me, you're saying that progressive government has resulted in nothing good, nothing worth supporting. So
well,
what?
I would say it's uneven.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some things.
So,
NOAA, for example, National Oceanic Administration, that did some good things.
Right.
And there are many other good things that have been done. But if you look at the money, I would say maybe 80% of the money, separate from Social Security, 80% of the money has just been flushed down the toilet.
So why continue spending money on
Why are we
progressive
doing this?
on progressive projects, Ben?
Yeah. So I would say that it's worth broadening your view out from the United States to the rest of the world. Okay. All right. Anybody didn't hear that? He doesn't care about the rest of the world. He's an American. Okay. Let me know when you want me to respond to your question. But
My question is specifically about the United States.
it's going to be a while.
I'm not interested in the rest of the world.
Okay.
I'm interested.
He says he's not interested in the rest of the world, which I think the gentlest way to put this is, if you want to have a well-informed opinion or one that has any relationship with reality, you should take an interest in the rest of the world, because that's the only way to find out, is to have, if you want to...
You're not answering the question.
I'm actually going to, if you shut the fuck up and let me answer at some point. You've interrupted several times as I've tried to answer your question, but given more speeches. But in any case, so if you want to have an answer that bears any relationship whatsoever to reality, you have to start looking at global comparisons to look at, see, okay, here's a problem in the United States. What are places that are doing this differently? What are places that are doing that differently? How might these differences be relevant to the difference in outcome? For example,
Norway.
You incorrectly stated earlier, no, I'm going to do Finland this time. You incorrectly stated earlier that America has a monopoly. Public schools have a monopoly, which is not true. That they have there are in fact plenty of private schools, parochial schools, plenty of homeschooling in the United States. Now, a country where there actually is something much closer, at least, to a public monopoly on education is Finland. essentially don't have private schools. That they in Finland. You know, you can have things that are sort of private schools, but you have to have the same curriculum, and it's funded ultimately same way, and you can't charge tuition, you know. So it's like, essentially, this is a place that actually does have a public monopoly on education, and they have what's widely regarded, including by right-wing charter school advocates when they're cherry-picking things about it that they like, as the best education system on the world, and the one that gets the best results. And so I would say that there are, in fact, a lot of global reasons to think that the United States, if it implemented policies that have been successful in Finland, in Norway,
In Iceland.
Sure, you know, Iceland actually less, but yes, they have that in plenty of other places. These are some of the ones where it's been the most advanced, which I understand why Curtis doesn't want to talk about them, because if you talk about the places that have come closest to my preferences,
Sweden,
then you're going to get this incredibly ideologically inconvenient result for him that it worked out fucking awesome. But even if you look at places that are a lot further from those sort of Nordic enclaves of social democracy in many ways, and much closer along the spectrum to the United States. You look at your Canadas, you look at your UKs, and you start comparing their healthcare systems, for example, and in every way that we can rank those things, that we know how to do them. Then, you know, I think maybe the survival rates for some cancers, not cancer in general, is better in the United States, but in almost every way that we know how to rank these things, those do better than the United States. So if you're just going to make generalizations about what he referred to as progressive governance, footnote, I think the word progressive doesn't really shed very much light on everything, and we'd probably all be much better off if we stopped using it, because it's used to describe everything from milquetoast centrist liberalism to up through, you know, democratic socialism, and we're talking about very different things, and we're having more clarificatory discussion about them if we distinguish them. And if we distinguish them, one of the things we'd find out very quickly is there are many countries that have much more extensive welfare states than the United States, and much better results than the United States.
Can I just had a brilliant idea, which I don't know if anyone's thought of this, but like I want Ben's. What if we put the government of Finland in charge of Haiti? Pro or con?
Yeah.
Then they would get eugenics.
So I have a slight, can I answer?
You were pretty evasive about eugenics earlier. But I don't know what the fuck you do think would be good for Haiti. You've used it as a punchline a lot, but I have heard you commit yourself to very little.
You know, for Haiti, I'm with John Stuart Mill, who was, when he was talking about India, said, you know, I'm for governing India as we govern Ireland with a good stout despotism. This is the author of Considerations on Representative Government. I think that probably the best government that Haiti had in the 20th century was the government of the Marines in the 20s and 30s. And so I think colonialism is an absolutely fine process for that. I also think that if you basically if the State Department could leave Haiti alone for like a year or two, it would come back and it would find a Haitian in charge of the entire island, probably one of these gang leaders that they're having problems with these days. I think that would probably work out actually considerably better than the system that they have at present.
It's always convenient.
I think more isolationism or more colonialism, either of those things would actually be much better for Haiti than the present. I want to answer, you know, your question sort of briefly, because I think that in addition to considering the rest of the world, you know, there's a slight problem, which is that the U.S. and the USSR together basically conquered the world in 1945, and so we live in a kind of political monoculture that came out of these two, if I can use the word, progressive regimes that conquered the world. And so I think that we make a very big mistake, and we're very parochial when we do not value the experience of the past as equal to the experience of the present. And so when we talk about, for example, the Salus Populi, we go back and we look at, for example, how, for example, Lord Burleigh, who governed England under Queen Elizabeth, would have regarded that question. And I think that there are sort of answers in those kinds of directions that would, I think that noting that we agree on that point is like a very, very important and relevant point. And I think that, you know, Ben's referred to, I guess in private, of his like program of a federal jobs guarantee. I sort of appreciate the spirit under which that's offered. I think it's better than UBI. I think there are other policies that can sort of give more people the dignity of labor in a way that's a little more dignified than I think that that would result in. But like understanding that basically the goal of government is to use absolute power, because all governments have absolute power, to support the health in the broadest sense of the people, is something that I think we can both agree on.
Yeah, I would like to give the dignity of labor to people who live off of their stock ownership or inheritance.
All right, last question, and then we got to go. I'm going to go with Casper right here.
Okay, this is for both of y'all. In relation to the, I guess, concept of democracy, what do you think the interplay between rights and power is?
What do you think the interplay between rights and power is?
Curtis,
Yeah, I don't, you know, the sort of concept of rights, I think, rests on a kind of misunderstanding of power. People are always looking for a power that's above power, in a sense, and then they delegate this power to the power that's above power, and they're like, oh, this is just a power. So this, for example, is why Ben and I sort of agree on this question of judicial review, where we're like, oh, we'll set a power that's above the power, and it will have the power to do non-democratic things like legalize abortion or ban abortion or some weird shit, you know, or legalize gay marriage when most Americans don't support it. And then magically American public opinion will swing around to support whatever power supports, which is the way public opinion works. And so you're sort of trying to always, there's this sort of quest for the magic power that's above mere humanity. And I think that that quest is sort of always going to fail.
Yeah, I hope any libertarians in the audience realize that they disagree with Curtis way more than they disagree with me. You know, what he's talking about when he says U.S. and USSR are both, you know, progressive and all that. What he means is they both reflect broad Enlightenment values, which, you know, so we have this. They
actually both use the word progressive.
We have this difference in opinion about the last few hundred years and, you know, and the advent of the modern world and the end of the ancien regime.
More like
where I think it's a good thing. So I will leave people to contemplate that. But just real quickly on this question about rights and power, I'd say there's a little bit of a category confusion here, right? One is a question about facts, one is a question about values. I think that the goals that we may value might involve certain people being allowed to do things or having certain expectations, and that's what we're labeling when we use this concept of right, which I think is just a useful way. We've all got normative goals. You might as well admit to that, right? Come clean and try to be internally consistent about it. And so yeah, I think there are various things I would refer to as rights, like self-government, but that is the sense in which I'm using the term.
Great.
Well, this got a little testy.
But we ended on this moment of beautiful agreement.
But I want to say, I think you're both brilliant, and I learned a lot from this, and I can't wait to listen back to it because I have more to learn when I listen to it more carefully. And I want to thank everyone who came and all the great questions, and I'd love for you to just give them a round of applause. Thank you.
This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.